Welcome to A Woman's Heart. I'm looking forward to this conversation because there have been all sorts of little snags going on. So I am anticipating an amazing conversation with Dr. Nancy Meyer. Thanks so much for joining us, Nancy.
I am so honored to be here. So excited.
Yes, well, so am I. And I would say I thoroughly enjoyed the book, but there were some hard things that we're going to get into. So, what I appreciated that the overarching thing was trusting in God and hope despite all of that hard stuff. And before we dive into that, I do always like to ask my guests to tell us a little bit about yourself and something fun that isn't normally in your bio so that we can all get to know you better.
Well, thank you. I'm an author, coach, and speaker. And, 18 years ago, I felt God tell me that I was going to write a book, speak, and wear leather pants. The leather pants was easy. Got that done. That was easy. The women's conference, a bunch of women were wearing leather pants. So that was easy. But it took me 18 years before I wrote my book. And even though I was called, I felt so mad and angry. But then I realized God hadn't revealed the story to me yet and what all he wanted me to put in the book.
Yeah.
And so I encourage others, even though you may feel like you've been called, the timing may not be right. Uh,
Yeah.
so something interesting about me is I'm a twin, actually, identical twin. Yes, I mean, we look exactly alike,
Okay.
sound alike. So we changed now. We have a little bit different hairstyle and stuff like that. But yeah, so that's something a lot of people don't know.
Yes, I did not realize that you were a twin. And I was going to say, a lot of times identical twins can look very much alike when they're little, but the older they get, just life and like, as you mentioned, hairstyles, you do look a lot of like, but there's a little bit, it's easier to tell the difference, the older people get sometimes, but that is kind of cool. And I know there's a special bond between twins.
Yes, yes.
Yes, there is. Now, I mentioned the book that you have, Defying Fear, and you mentioned that that was an 18-year journey. So this is not just something that happened overnight. What were some of you mentioned that you had the story, and what were some of the things that when you first led that you thought you were going to include in the book? Or maybe something that you thought you were going to write about it, but then it turned into something different.
Mhm. Actually, I mean, a lot of it was different. Um,
Mm,
I thought I've been through, a lot growing up, a lot of abandonment issues and stuff like that. And I thought that would be it, and different stress levels. I've had 6 ulcers at one time, so I'm quite the overachiever when it comes to worry. And I thought it was going to be stuff like that. But actually, the relationships that I went to, abusive relationships and stuff like that, hadn't even happened. And
mm,
that, was a big part of the book. And even like my training, the half Ironman triathlons, that hadn't happened yet. So
yeah.
there's a lot. It's funny how you're like, oh, you wanted me to include that in there. And you don't know at the time when you're doing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you're a licensed chiropractor, so you've had a lot of other things. How do you think God has worked all of those pieces? Because as you mentioned, you maybe thought you had one thing in mind, but God had something else in mind. Not that He's not going to bring the other one about later on. Maybe there's two or three more books in you. We'll see. And but how do you think He worked some of those pieces together for those people that think, oh, I think I have this picture painted in my head, but it doesn't seem to be working out that way. How's he used all those pieces?
Well, I think the thing is what we think, okay, this is what's happening.
Hmm.
But really, God is molding us to make this happen.
Mm.
And even I was saying the other day with my chiropractic, I was like, oh, that's why you had me doing that completely different thing from
Yeah.
speaking and writing and, and wearing leather pants, completely different. But he's molded me to make me be what he wants me to be, right?
Hmm.
I think everything we do in, I've even talked to people like, oh, I did this is totally not, needed now. No, everything you do, God uses and he makes that help you to reach whatever his plans are for you. We just
Yeah.
have to be open to it and just realize. I think most of the time we don't realize he comes full circle every time he comes full circle. We just don't realize all the stuff he's planted and used in our lives to help us where he wants us to go.
Hmm. And you mentioned the abusive relationships
Mhm.
that you had been in. One of the things, there's a lot of theories about why people get into relationships like that. And some of them are there's holes inside of us that draw us to, or there's things about us that they are drawn to. What are some of the warning signs that we can either look for ourselves or look for in a loved one that may be headed in that direction that maybe we can go, oh, that's a warning sign. Maybe we should back up. Or how we could tell a loved one that we see warning signs.
Well, to be honest, I think it's really hard to tell a loved one if you see a warning sign. They
Yeah.
have to see it for themselves. So
Hmm.
that's really a very tricky area.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know if somebody would have told me if I really would have heard it.
Hmm.
A couple things. One is, do they bear fruit? They
Hmm.
can say all kinds of wonderful things. For me, I'm one to see them people as good. Even
Yes.
now, I see good. But I have to look at it and say, wait a minute, what they're saying is great, but do their actions, when people aren't looking at them and seeing them, when they're not in the spotlight, do those match their actions, the way they behave, match the way they speak? And
Yeah.
that's where you can see it a lot. For me, I saw that, but I didn't understand that. I
Okay.
was like, oh, because when you're in an abusive relationship, they say just enough to keep you hanging on.
Hmm.
They also keep you very busy so that you can't have time to think. You
Yeah.
allow that to happen. But they just say just enough, like, oh, you're your weight, you don't look good. But then you're like, oh, but hey, this looks nice or something like that. I mean, just a little bit to keep you going, to keep you thrown off.
Yeah.
Like, well, yeah, but they said this nice. Okay, but
Hmm.
are they being nice? Are they nice? Are they true to what they say? Do they treat you, talk to you the same way that they do when you're out in public? And
Hmm.
that's the other thing. I think the biggest thing for people to get out of a traumatic, trauma, bad relationship is they have to learn to value themselves.
Yeah.
For me, which are like people are like, oh, you're a doctor. Here I am, highly educated. I mean, I had house, career, kids, everything, right? Everything. But I did not value myself. I didn't value myself that I deserved to be happy. I was like, I'm not appreciative. I have all this stuff, but I didn't value myself or love myself enough to realize I deserve to be happy. That's okay. Because that's our right to be happy. That God wants us to be happy.
Hmm.
And then my value comes not from myself, but from our unshakable self-worth through Christ.
Yeah.
Period. And once you realize your value through Christ, that you should be loved, valued, and cherished, then it changes your perspective of how you're being treated and how you should be treated. And it goes both ways.
Yeah.
But first, you have to love yourself because people that are in an abusive relationship, they're courageous, they're strong because they're in it. They go back and face it every day.
Yeah.
But do they value themselves enough and think with their mind, just not with their heart? Because you love them, love them. I mean, for me, I was like, hey, all this abusive happened. And then I realized, I talk about that in my book, it was 3 months after all this, everything was taken away from me, literally everything, kids, trying, everything's taken away. And I was like, I want this person to hold me and hug me and tell me everything would be okay. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm one of those women, those abused women that want their abuser to love me
Yeah.
because my worth doesn't come from that. It comes from Christ. And that's what we forget. But once you realize that, then take the steps for you to be loved, to truly be loved.
Yeah. You touched on the being grateful. Is at times I have seen where in the church, you mentioned you're told just enough. And people can see certain things and go, oh, but you have the house, you have the dog. They see a persona. And then it does kind of add to that, as I was reading the book, I was like, oh my gosh, I can see where you could be in a situation, go, wait a minute, this isn't quite right. But yet other people are saying, well, you should just be grateful for what you have and somehow settle that then it's okay to settle for something that it is making you hurt or sad. And yet there's something inside that goes, no, that's not right. And then you're being told to be grateful. How do you think that can be abused, that being grateful? Because I agree that we should be grateful for what we have. And there's so much good stuff about gratitude. But at what point does it maybe cross the line and not become helpful?
Well, I think the key to one of the keys to life is being, gratitude and grateful. But I think what happens is people think that in a bad situation that it's always bad.
Mm,
That it's not. It can have, and someone even spoke, told me this too. They were saying after reading my book, they're like, I realize you said that there's good times too. See, they think,
yeah.
oh, good times, that's good. Okay, yes, you will have that, but does it, is it still abuse? Is it still wrong? I mean, how are they doing it? Even though you might have some good times, it doesn't make that it's okay. It's not okay to be that. And I think when social media, all that stuff, everything, I try to show stuff where I'm like, I'm actually having anxiety. Okay. I'm having a panic attack. This is how I handle it. Where social media, a lot of times it's all about, oh, this is great. Everything's good. Look,
Yeah.
look, but I think where yes, you be grateful, but what is the overall theme? What is it? I mean, I felt so lonely before. I mean, I was so lonely. And
Mm,
you shouldn't be lonely if you're if you're married and with kids. I mean, you shouldn't be.
yeah.
Something then it doesn't mean that that relationship may not be good, but you need to change. Something needs to change. And
Yeah.
I think where it's like, oh no, just keep still, be quiet, and keep going. No, no.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I find it interesting. The book is defining fear, which I wouldn't necessarily think of right off the bat for something with an abusive relationship or whatever. I would think more like strength or power. But I think that the point is that there is so much of that fear wrapped up that causes us to do what we're going to do or not do out of fear, fear of failure, fear of success, fear of, there's so many different kinds of fears that we can that then drive these bad habits or negative habits that keep us stuck. Why did you focus on the fear part of it? What was that? Why did he really want to say tackle the fear part?
Well, I think that everything really underlying is a fear. So your worry, your self-doubt, the insecurities, it's really fear-based.
Hmm.
So really, yeah, I believe my book is about going from fear to faith
Yeah.
in that we have to have action. So faith without, works without action is like void, it's insufficient. It doesn't do anything.
Hmm.
Truly believe, then we have to take those action steps. And I believe that the fear is what's holding us back. And the thing is it's not that it goes away, it's that you still do it despite the fear.
Hmm.
Do it despite the fear. And so I think the book, it tries everybody that has whatever they're going through, what they went through, when they read the book, they find themselves in it from whatever they've been through. So
Yeah.
even if it's where a parent that's been, really restrictive on them or, persecuting that way, or a spouse or a boss or themselves. I think
Yeah.
one of the worst things abusive comes from ourselves and how we
Yeah.
talk to ourselves. But if you get over that fear with faith, that's really one of the keys. And the faith is in, Jesus.
Hmm. I love how you pointed out in the book a couple of times, and the format is you have the story that's somewhat based on your own life and several other stories. So it's not a real person that Lila is. She's kind of a compilation, but some of the things in the book really did happen, and you talk about part of the story of her story, and then you have a thing at the end or at the end of each chapter that kind of draws out, no, trust yourself, go ahead and investigate, lean on friends. You talk about different things in there, and you did point out one of the things was making the choice to put into action. And that was one of the things that you really stressed that I liked. And what led you to not just tell a story, but have that chapter broken up with different things at the end of each chapter?
So I like, take an example from Jesus doing parables, right? He told
Mhm.
stories. And then I have that part, the reality. So every story in there is true. It's from different, multiple different women, but every story. And then the perspective of it may not be exactly what I went through, but my
Mhm.
perspective of similar thing that I went through with that.
Yeah.
And just to kind of break it down, because I think sometimes we need a little help with it as far as, okay, how
Mhm.
can I apply this with my life? How can this help me? And that's what I try to do, but not in a preachy way, like,
Yeah.
hey, because I knew for me at my time, if I didn't think I was good enough to even be there, to be loved. And so if I approach it as a way of like, look, here's some examples, here's how I did it, and then here's some steps you can take, kind of like that.
Mhm.
Um, so that it was like, okay, I can do this, even though I'm not, perfect. I'm, which none of us are, but it was from a perspective of like, come on, join Lila in this journey and how she triumphs and gets over this different things. You can too.
Yeah, yeah, and I really did appreciate that. You also mentioned the commonality in that you don't have to have been in an abusive relationship to learn from this book. There were things that were in there with the fear and the things that hold you back, and making that choice to stand up and go, wait a minute, I'm not going to let that stand in the way anymore. So I really appreciated how anybody can gain from this. Anybody reading the book about
Thank you.
whatever fears that they are facing. And as I mentioned earlier, there were some things in the book where for me, I was heartbroken that somebody would treat somebody else that way, but that's not the overarching theme of your book. It
Right.
really is more of a, yes, these things are terrible, but there's still hope. You can still keep going. You can still learn from this and come out better on the other side. One of my favorite quotes, that was one of the first ones. I was like, oh, I am so writing this down somewhere, was I think it was Shane Cos Corzan, Coxan. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but it said, "If your heart is broken, make art with the pieces."
Yes. Yes.
Where did you find that quote? Do you
Well,
remember?
so much was God inspired. Even writing this book, I'm like, I would see something and think about it, and then boom, something else would show up exactly what I was thinking. But I think that the key is that, first of all, I believe the biggest abuse comes from ourselves and
Yeah,
how we treat ourselves and how we talk and how we don't take care of ourselves too.
yeah,
And then we're all just pieces. And it's taking those broken pieces and making something out of it. And that's what God does. And
yeah.
he uses the imperfect. He doesn't do the perfect because then it's not him, it would be us. And
Mhm.
so because I am imperfect, God uses me. I'm like, wow, that's just so hopeful. That's just so wonderful that I have something to offer because of what and who he is. And yeah, just taking those pieces and making something out of it. That's what he does. And that's if we allow him to. That's the
Yeah,
key. And
yeah.
take those steps of faith.
Yeah, I think so. What is, you deal with a lot, probably a lot of women that are facing their fears. What are some of those common, like there's a lot of different kinds of fears. But what would you typically say to someone who is struggling with fear? What is one of the better pieces of advice that you have for them?
That you're not alone.
Mm.
And I think the biggest thing is people think that they're alone with it. And that's why, the truth will set you free. Literally, whatever stuff that's holding you back, where you're self abusive because of whatever happened, trauma, stuff like that, we end up internalizing it because we think we're the only ones. But if you share it, it's a releasing. And it's like acknowledging it to yourself. It's giving yourself permission. And it's funny because you hold on to it. We just hold on to it. But if we admit it out loud and then say it to somebody, and you can say it to someone you trust, okay,
Yeah.
that you feel this way, or I've been neglected as, whatever, if you were neglected as a child or whatever, different, whatever it could be, or I'm in a situation abusive, or, I fear success, or I fear of not being perfect. If you share that, you're just like releasing that. And it's a freedom, which is funny because it's completely opposite of what you think it would be. But
Yeah.
it's actually a freedom of sharing that and acknowledging that. But then what Satan does is he holds that onto you. He holds that over you so that you don't do what God has plans for you to do. He does. I mean, there's no way. And if anybody ever told me that I would do a half Ironman where I'm swimming, I never swam. Had to learn to swim before doing the triathlon in my 50s at 53. And I
Wow.
never ran more than 3 miles. So I ran a marathon at the end of doing all that other stuff. There's no way. I was like, no way, I can do that. But if we allow God to work in us and take what we think we can't do and change that fear, despite me being afraid, I'm still going to be open. I'm still going to pursue. I'm still going to do. And just let the honesty come out. I think it's just freeing. And it allows us to like put that aside and then be able to pursue our dreams and more importantly, God's dreams for us.
Yeah. Why do you think he placed the dream of a triathlon since you didn't swim?
Well, okay, so it would be honest. So there's a fear, I think FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
That was me. And so my friends were doing it, they're biking. I biked a lot. So I biked with friends and stuff. And it was coming to my hometown, the Virginia Blue Ridge Triathlon, the half Ironman. And I'm like, well, I don't want to be left out. And so 53, I'm like, okay, but you don't know how
Pressure
to
is
swim.
alive and well.
Yeah, and literally my first, I mean, I can't even swim halfway across the pool. So I have to share. My husband says, always tell everybody the reason why you did well is because I kept saying more swim lessons. But YouTube videos, they help. It's amazing what you can learn from them. But literally I was doing a swim lesson and the coach, I had a handful of swim lessons. The coach videoed me and she shows me the video and she's like, you're going backwards. I mean, literally, I'm swimming and going back. It was a kicking drill. I was going backwards. I mean, that's how bad I was. But it just shows what God can do. I mean, at 53, I had people saying, you don't learn how to swim in your 50s. But you know what? They don't know my God. They don't know your God. They don't know our God and what He is capable of doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mentioned one of the other things that came to mind as we were talking in the book was it's kind of a constant balancing between pushing yourself and giving yourself some grace.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I loved that balancing act between pushing yourself to learn how to swim, but giving yourself grace that you weren't at an Olympic rate.
No. And that's what I learned too. It's not the swim is really a warm up for the triathlon. And I can tell you the first triathlon I did, I had major panic attack. I mean, like I couldn't do more than 10 strokes the whole time. It was bad. I was like throwing up. I mean, I was nauseous. I usually, I'm like, whoa, coming out. My family saw me. I was like, dear Lord, don't let me puke coming out of this water. Don't let me. I mean, it felt like eternity. I decided hell is going to be treading water and never be able to get out. But it was so hard. I mean, that short sprint race, which was like 20 miles versus 70 some miles,
Mm,
harder than the big one because of mentally what it did to me with that swim. But it taught me perseverance. It taught me just to hang on. It taught me to swim buoy to buoy, not the whole race. And
yeah.
that's what we have to do with life, is that even though it's very hard, very, very hard at times, but keep hanging on because eventually we'll get to the end, to the next buoy, then the next buoy, the next one, and we'll get to the finish line. And then you know what? It'll start all over again. But
Yep.
that's okay. It makes us better, makes us stronger.
Yeah, I remember taking the timing chips. There was some like half small triathlon kind of thing here in town, and I volunteered to help out, and I took the timing chips off of people's ankles.
Yeah.
And there were some that just kind of came across the line and they bent down, took it off and handed it to me. And then there were the ones that had this look of panic and terror when I said, I'm here to take your timing chip. And I was like, don't worry, I'll bend down and get it. And they were like, oh, thank you. Thank you so much. The idea of bending over and taking that timing chip off themselves was just more than they could handle.
But this is the thing. They all finished, right? They crossed the
All
finish line.
finished. They
It may
did.
take you, it's like when I said, well, I can't run, or I'm like, I don't care. Do what you can do. But
Yeah.
they all did the same thing. If
Mhm.
you went faster, you worked harder because you pushed faster. But if you took longer, then you worked harder because it took you longer.
Yeah,
But we all
that's true
finished.
too.
And
That,
that's why we can all have whatever we do. We can do our, our thing that God has put on our hearts. And it's at whatever level that we're at. We're still, that's good. That's okay.
yeah. Yeah, I love that. Well, I greatly encourage. There's several people that I've already thought, oh, you should read this book, and not because they're in a relationship or anything like that, but just because it's good. And I know people in counseling, and there's just so much good stuff in there. So I really encourage people to do that. And as we're kind of starting to wrap up, one of the questions that I always like to ask, and I loved your answer, is you are pursuing those things that God has placed a passion in you to do. You're the triathlon, pushing through and writing your book and coaching other women. And that, what would you say to encourage someone else to pursue the passion that God has placed in their heart?
So God places a passion on your heart. He doesn't do it for no reason at all. It's there, and He will give you what it takes to get through to accomplish that. You just have to trust Him and take whatever steps. The hardest thing for me, I think, with being in the ministry was what am I supposed to do? What, like, I knew He's had me called to do this, but what was my next step?
Yeah.
What I felt Him say was wait. Oh, I hate that. Wait. But do what you know right now that you can do, which is an act of faith, and then God will show you. He will direct you. But just take that first step. Even though you don't know exactly where it's going to lead, take that first step, and then God will direct you to where that's going to go.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think that is very wise advice because sometimes we see this goal that we want to be there, way off at the very end of the race, and yet we can't see it. We don't know exactly how we're going to get there, and so we get frozen. And so I do. And there have been times where, for me, if I call it a brain fog or a brain scramble, when there's just so many things going on, or I also call it elephant syndrome, where I'm staring at the elephant and I'm like, I know I'm supposed to take one bite at a time, but I don't even know where to start. Uh, is
Exactly.
is to take that pause or deep breath and go, okay, just really what is the next step? Where do I start? I've like 10 things on my list or 20 or 50 things on my list. What's the priority and what's the next step? And that can, and some, usually if I actually sit there and get quiet enough, something will bubble up. And even if it's just something small, it'll be just do this. And it gives you momentum to keep going.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I really like that. Well,
Thank you.
Dr. Nancy, if someone is interested in getting your book or connecting with you or having you to speak or coach, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
One thing they can do is if they want a list of positive affirmations, because I'm big on that, because that's a step to take too,
Yeah.
is they can actually text Nancy, Nancy, to 55444. So
Okay.
that's a really good, real good way to connect and get a free gift. So you can use this screensaver or whatever. But they can go to my website, Dr. Nancy Meyer, DrNancyMeyer.com, and they can find me as far as social media stuff, and I'd love for them to join me on my journey and see exactly where God takes me and bring them along and see that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have, a clear vision even.
Yeah.
You just have to take that next step.
Mm-hmm.
I just love that. I love to show people how to take care of themselves too. I think that's something we don't do.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, but I would love to see them and work with them. They can connect with me there too.
Very good. Well, I am looking forward to another sunrise stretching
Right.
exercise on the beach. Hopefully, the sun will cooperate the next time. It's a very cloudy day at the retreat, so I will look forward to doing that to get in shape in that. But more than that, I really appreciate your taking the time to speak to us today. I know we were both having some crazy schedules, so I'm glad it worked out and you took the time to speak with us today. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate your bravery, your vulnerability, and your authenticity just in your life and in your book. I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you too.